Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. We're going to continue on with this week's theme of rhythm section heroes, checking out songs that predominantly feature bass or drum lines, sometimes both, that make the song what it is. That the song would be lesser if it had a more generic or iterative drum or bass part. Today we're going to be looking at the group Kylesa. Looking at the song Said and Done, the 2022 remaster. No context for this one, let's just dive straight in. Really interesting mix on the drums. There's a general push and pull between the time feel on the drums too. Yeah, interesting polyrhythm against the original 4/4. It's like a hemiola, but only playing the 3 instead of the old 2. And building a new 4 off of that. It's interesting how little cymbal goes into this. All right. An interesting one for this week. It doesn't have the typical obvious spotlight put onto the drums. And the bass is pretty much just doing what the guitars are. They're certainly not the highlight of this, but I think this was picked for the drum work. And I do think there is something that elevates this track through that instrument. And I think a lot of it comes down to the way that the drummer uses the kit. A lot of the times we have this push and pull. We have a standard speed and then the double time when we get those constant eighth notes on the bass kicks and the snares and the toms. And it just really pushes the song forward. And then we'll kind of pull it back and we'll enter into a bit of a backbeat accent snare on 2 and 4, I think. And it just kind of feels like the song chills out for a little bit, at least from a momentum perspective. The guitars and the vocals keep things fairly intense throughout, but the drums kind of have this laid back and then rushing forward and then laid back and rushing forward. This isn't unusual for sludge metal. But what I do find unusual is sort of the lack of cymbals. This concept of building and releasing tension through how many times the drum is hit every single bar is not usually done as grounded as this. There is a lot of tom work, but honestly, there's an interesting part to the toms too, where they're tuned a specific way. Part of this is going to be the tuning of the drums themselves, but there's also the production side that a producer is going to do with the mix and EQ and maybe some other touch-ups here and there. But the high toms are bouncy. There's a water drop kind of whoop, whoop, a little bounce to it. Something that feels like just a narrow, because you know, sound starts out quiet. You haven't played the note yet. Then it ramps up, hits a peak volume, and then comes down. That's just how notes work, especially percussive notes, which are kind of just one and done. You might have a ringing out if there is, you know, like a glockenspiel or something, the vibration still existing through the metal. The snare drum is going to have the rattling of the snare beads underneath. So there are ways to sort of taper off a percussive sound. But for something like a tom, you hit it, rises in volume, and then kind of flattens back out. But here there's a little boop, a little hump at the top of it. And it feels really interesting. But it also feels very light. There is almost a cymbal-esque quality to it. Something that allows it to fit in the same realm as the cymbals. And part of it is going to be pitch. I heard this primarily on the highest tom, certainly not on the floor tom. But there's also just something in it that works. It doesn't feel bassy like a lot of toms are. It may just be that the drum head is wound incredibly tight and that's creating this effect. But regardless, the high tom is frequently used in here in the place where I would normally hear a hi-hat. And I think that's really interesting. It adds a specific flavor to this track that, one, again, there's just not a lot of high-end shimmery stuff going on. That's not to say that the cymbals are sparsely used. They are still present in almost every section of this track, but the mix heavily de-emphasizes them to the point that almost anything else on the kit is going to be heard more clearly and more dominantly. And I just find that interesting because it grounds the song. There's almost a tribal feeling throughout this track because of the heavy use of the toms. The snare is still an accent instrument. It is used way less frequently than the toms are. And the bass kick kind of gets grouped into the tom area as they all kind of have this generally drier sound, whereas the snare has the snare bead rattle and the cymbals have the vibrations through it that create the shimmer, whereas the bass kick and the toms are sort of just one and done. You hit it and you get the sound, and that's kind of it. And so when you put in the eighth notes, when you put in these tom runs, when you use this high tom as an accent in the same way that maybe a hi-hat would be used, you create something that feels similar to other sludge metal, but also puts its own flavor. It's like I don't know what it's like. It's very interesting to my ears though, because there's a lot of familiar elements to it, but I can't say that I've heard anything quite like this. And I appreciate that. It's interesting too, because most of this week has been interesting bass or drum parts. Basically, where another musician wouldn't have come up with that part. But this, the composition is pretty standard. It's actually how the kit is used. I think if we replace some of this tom stuff with more traditional cymbal work, and we kept the same rhythmic devices, we just changed which parts of the kit were being used for it, and the mix emphasized the cymbals a little bit more traditionally, I don't think there would be a lot compositionally here that would sound very different. But it is quite a unique approach to this. On the other side of that, though, is also the placement of the drums, which seem to be hard panned out to the side. I've talked about this this week, actually, I believe, where typically the hi-hat to the snare, to the high toms, to the low toms, and the ride cymbal are over here. They're panned in the music the same way that they are placed around the drummer, or sometimes it's done from the other perspective, how you would see it as an audience, with the hi-hat over to the right and then going over to the low toms. I'm not as big of a fan of that mix style, but it is something that pops up. Regardless, drums are typically panned across the mix. But not like this. Drums kind of feel like they're center and then center out to the side. Sort of a narrow angle here, so that if you ever took off one earbud or one headphone or turned off one side of your speakers, you're not going to miss out on the information. It just might seem a little light or quiet in the mix. This, though, is hard panned. If you only listen to one channel on this, you're missing so much information. And that's really interesting for drums. But another thing it has is this effect of spatiality. The drums almost feel outside of the music. And in a lot of ways, I hear the guitar and the vocals and the bass all center. They're telling the story. The drums are driving the energy almost as an external force, not within the band like everyone else is, but sitting outside of it. So related to the drums, but not specifically about the drums, it's another unique part of this. Especially when we get into those faster parts with the tom runs and the bass kicks. I mean, it feels like it's this energy building on the outskirts, the walls of this sound. Very interesting. Now, as for the rest of the track, much like the drum composition itself is only slightly different, I really don't hear a lot of change to anything else here. This is a sludge metal track through and through. Our vocals are straightforward. They got that punky yelling kind of thing. It's not completely false chord like a growl would be. There is some typical vocal cord work in there, but there is a rasp, there is a compression to it, and it's fairly monotone throughout. There's little bits of movement, but it's not like the vocalist is trying to make anything melodic. So we just have this guy shouting at us, and then we have some sick guitar riffs throughout this track. And the guitars are fuzzy and meaty and textured. I mean, this is what sludge metal is all about. It is about the size and the feel of the guitar tones. And this matches it. The riffs are cool, but again, not really melodic either. They're definitely rule of cool. They sound sick. They make you want to, move your body, get into a mosh pit, whatever. But they're not melodically driven. And I think we can see an interesting honing in of this at the end, as we just have two notes. Da-na-na, 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 da-na-na. That really is the core heartbeat to a lot of the riffage on this. We do have some that expanded out a little bit more, but the majority of this is on a simpler idea, and that is basically just two notes with some extra flourish as we move between them. The ending, I think, is really the blueprint. It's the foundation of all the guitar riffage on here. Everything else is a slight embellishing of that simplicity. It is cool, it sounds sick, it is not complex, but it is fun, and it absolutely fits the mood and atmosphere of this track. And that's, I guess, about all I have to say about this one. The drum work is wild. Everything else is what I would expect, is shouting and loud, heavy guitars. And even the drum part, as I mentioned, is what I would expect. It's just handled in a fairly unique way. So let's hit some lyrics on this one. I believe this track is a pessimistic view of the future. It says, as these old days rust and new ones come, it's all said and done. As these days fade away and new ones sway, it's all been done. So this idea that, our past is rusting. It's so old that it's so far behind us that it is beginning to break down, but that the days coming in, they're not interesting. It says the new days are swaying. The bridge says this new dawn is callous, and this time is not for us. This time is not calling. Our numbers, they are falling. So bring forever forth silent tongues. This idea that we need change, and that's impossible. It says our numbers are falling. We don't have the strength to actually make anything better. It says that the new dawn is callous. It is not anything that has goodwill towards us. It says this time is not even for us. Our future is not ours. And so the bring forth silent tongues is interesting. I wonder if that's a command or a description. It could be that we need people to speak up, but no one does. But it could be that speaking up isn't even worth it anymore. We had a chance for that, and that time is past. So now everyone can just be silent. Don't even need anyone to speak up anymore. The path is set. Regardless, they don't have a lot of hopes for the future. And that's it. There's a lot of repetition. There's 4 verses, and 3 of them are all the first verse that I stated. The second one is a small variation. It says, as these days still stay and some of them kill, it's said and done, falling towards gravity's end. There's doom on the horizon, and we can't do anything to change it. We cross that threshold. That's it. Interesting for a song that, it has dynamic qualities to it at times, but I guess it's also kind of locked into its sound. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. The world's locked into its ways. The music doesn't really veer too far outside of what it's doing either. They kind of parallel each other that way. These are my thoughts then on Kylesa's Said and Done. What did you think of this track? Is there anything that stood out to you? Anything that you would like to add on to what I said or correct me on? Do you have your own take, perspective, or opinion on this? Let me know. Put that in the comment section below, along with anything else you'd like to add. Above that, in the description box, is a link to Linktree. Takes you here. You can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all 3 of those. That wraps it up for today. I'll be back tomorrow, though, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 9 p.m. UTC as usual. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.